Right, Sam's here now. So everyone, thank you for joining us. Sam's here. We're just waiting for Rob, and we're going to give everyone a couple more minutes to get logged on before we get started. Don't want to be too prompt in case people are having trouble getting in. Hi, Rob.
Hello, hi. How's it going?
Good, thank you. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us. I've said this again, but thank you for those who have joined us. I'm Jess from Assent Risk Management, and I have Sam and Rob here with me. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please pop a comment in. We will get to questions at the end, but feel free throughout the webinar. If you have any questions that come into mind, write them in there. We can get to them, but we'll just give it a couple more minutes before we get started, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, no problem. I feel like maybe we should have got some elevator music because it's insanely quiet when we're not talking, isn't it? Yeah. Tip for next time.
Yeah, next time. Okay, I think I've seen a few more people join, so we'll make a start. Any latecomers can always join on. So welcome to our webinar on SOC 2 and ISO 27001. I am Jess from Assent Risk Management, and I am joined today by Sam, who is also representing Assent Risk Management, and also Rob Hall from TempoAudits. So straight into our speakers. Obviously, I just said we've got Sam. So Sam is representing Assent, and we've got Rob representing Tempo. Sam, Rob, how are you guys today?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, good. Excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to getting into this topic. Before we get into this stuff about ISO 27001 and SOC 2, first of all, I'm going to do a quick little introduction about Assent. So Assent Risk Management, we were founded back in 2002 by Robert Clements. So there's two Robs. It always gets very confusing. And we started sort of in the IT industry, and then sort of our first standards that we started working with were ISO 27001, interestingly. So we are consultant auditors for international standards. We ourselves are certified to ISO 9001, 14001, and 27001 ourselves. We have a network of consultants that span the UK. So we are based throughout the UK. We're not just in one section. And then we also have some international clients as well. So we work with clients in America as well as Europe and Australia as well. You can see on the side here, we've got some of our badges that we have. So we are a living wage employer. We've got Cyber Essentials certified. We're disability confidence. And we also work with ecology as well. So that's a little bit about Assent. Moving on to a little bit about Tempo.
Cool. Yeah, so I set up Tempo a couple of years ago. We aim to be a bit of a breath of fresh air in the world of certification and information security audits. I'm the founder and I set it up, having been a tech founder of a product-based tech company before. And then I used to work at a platform that prepares people for these audits. And my role was to create ratios with all the audit companies. And I kept seeing the same thing, that for those of you who know about ISO 27001 and SOC 2 audits, the audit companies can be quite slow moving, not really set up for modern tech companies, and not really sort of a helpful audit experience. So I set up Tempo 2 years ago to be like a modern version of UCAS accredited certification, and our key values are being helpful, fast moving, tech centric. We often find that we're doing fully remote audits for sort of fast moving tech companies, and and that's really cut through since we launched. And I've got Tempo and a few numbers here. Actually, if we can skip on to the next slide.
Yep.
Yeah, so we've been trading for a couple of years now. We're UCAS accredited for ISO 27001. We've got 42001 coming up soon. We've got 330 customers across Europe, but a lot in the UK. 17 auditors. Most of our customers are 0 to 100. Now we're increasingly growing to 200, but we have a lot of small tech teams. That's our sort of bread and butter. I'm a founder myself, and we work really well with those sort of companies. And we're really striking a chord in terms of providing a sort of modern, fast-moving audit experience. We started doing SOC 2 audits about a year ago, and that's now a really fast-growing part of our business. And as you can imagine, a lot of companies that get ISO 27001 move on to doing SOC 2 a bit down the line. And likewise, we're getting more customers coming directly to our SOC 2, and then they move on to ISO as well. And there's obviously a bit of a crossover that we can discuss today.
Fantastic, thank you. So into our sort of our first topic or question that we're looking at, and we're going to just look at the key differences and the similarities to ISO 27001 and SOC 2. So Sam, I'll let you take this one away.
Yeah, of course. So 27001 and SOC 2 sit in a similar space, I suppose. There are a lot of elements that overlap in both frameworks, but there are some sort of distinct differences as well. So in terms of similarities, well, first of all, they're both IT-based frameworks, but they're both risk-based. So step one for implementation of either framework is to identify risks to the business, and then select suitable controls that are compliant with the framework requirements, implement them, and then monitor them to ensure that they're running appropriately, consistently, and delivering sort of the right outputs, really. There are overlapping controls within both frameworks. So neither framework typically prescribes any specific controls, but there are industry recognized IT-based controls that are applicable to satisfying the criteria of both of the framework requirements. So examples would be multi-factor authentication, access control, vulnerability management. They're themes that run through both frameworks. So there are overlapping controls. I'd say probably 70 to 80% of the controls are at least similar across both frameworks. So yeah, they are quite similar, to be fair, in that aspect. Both frameworks require documented policy requirements. Examples would be access control policies, acceptable use policies, incident response plans, policies, procedures, business continuity. Those types of policies generally act as foundational requirements or pillars for information availability and overall control. So document the policy, disseminate it to employees, appropriate stakeholders of the organization, and ensure the requirements are adhered to. Key differences, really, the main one is that I guess the methodology behind the frameworks is slightly different. So for ISO 27001, it's a management system based methodology. So it's around implementing controls that lead to repeatability of output and information security control. So there's elements in 27001 standard that are required, that essentially standardized the way that the business operates, and really strives for continual improvement and repeatability of output. So things look similar kind of most of the time. There are nuances and deviances, obviously, business is business, but for in the main, we're looking at standardization. Whereas for SOC 2, it's not necessarily focused as much on the management system side. It's more focused on the control types and the effectiveness of the selected controls. So it's looking at what controls have been selected, are they appropriate, and essentially are they consistently running and producing the right type of protection for the business. So yeah, similar frameworks, but ever so slightly different. Just coming back to the management system based side of things, for anyone who's not familiar with the management system concept, some inclusions that would sort of enable a business to operate a management system will be things like documentation of objectives, looking at risk management, the internal audit process to monitor and measure how effectively the processes are performing and producing correct outputs, and items like management review. They kind of all lead to standardization through the implementation of a management system.
Fab, thanks, Sam. I really appreciate that. We're going to stick with Sam for our next one for a bit. We're going to look at why do customers request SOC 2, ISO 27001, or both? Because obviously we talked about it might be both sometimes as well. So what do we think to
that? So in terms of why do people sort of select the framework? So Rob and I were having a discussion just before the webinar started, and we kind of both agreed from a consultant point and from a certification body point, it is very, very largely commercially driven. So what we tend to see is customers, I guess, pull the trigger, for want of a better phrase, when there's some sort of key variable that sort of means that they need to obtain either 27001 certification or an attestation report for SOC 2 compliance. That could be industry driven. It might be that a big customer's asking them to obtain some sort of certificate. It could be, that's generally the main driver. Location of customer base, so whether it's US, Europe, worldwide, both frameworks are internationally recognized. SOC 2 tends to be a little bit more of an American concept. It has overspilled out all over the globe because obviously there's American or large American companies you'll have global suppliers who will be required to sort of invest in the SOC 2 framework, but it is becoming more increasingly common in the European areas. So it depends on where the customer base is as which framework selected. There is an emerging industry-based mandatory requirement for framework implementations such as 27001 and SOC 2. So in a lot of industries and different sectors now, it's a mandatory requirement by larger businesses for their supply chain to be SOC 2 or ISO 27001 accredited or certified. So a lot of the time when businesses are tendering for work, it'll be an outright requirement. They'll be required to fill in some sort of questionnaire. If they don't have a 27001 certificate or they don't have a SOC 2 attestation report, they won't be considered as part of that tender. Process standardization from the 27001 aspect. So looking at, like we discussed in the previous slide, management system implementation leads to standardization of processes, doing the same thing or at least running process in a similar fashion for consistently conformant outputs it is a big benefit to businesses. So we do see customers who approach framework implementation because they want to standardize processes. And from a consultant point of view, one thing that I see commonly is I'll go into a small business or even a small to medium sized business that are growing. They might be private equity backed, or they might just be growing in general. Is that the cracks start small, but they do get big very quick. So in terms of framework implementation, you can quite quickly close some of those gaps or identify, small scale risks at the point in time where they're mitigatable, and you can sort of prevent them from growing in size, really. Both frameworks are based around information security management. SOC 2 more from the data security and privacy side of things, but security of the data that a company holds. They might process special category data, personally identifiable information, but looking at operating within legal bounds, so in compliance with Data Protection Act, GDPR, and also customer requirements. Management of information security risks, kind of already briefly touched on, but both frameworks require identification of risks, and really the ethos behind, I guess, framework implementation and an ongoing management and control is about mitigating information security risks. So it's bringing them down to most reasonable level that's acceptable to the business, and sort of demonstrating an ongoing effort to keep the security posture of the business in a good state. And both frameworks are internationally recognized. So obviously there's a benefit there to companies who work with other companies or clients on a global scale. So just because one business operates in the UK and one operates in America or in a European region, that standard or that framework still reads exactly the same.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I was just going to add a few points to that, which is obviously in an ideal world, everyone would just be doing ISO 27001 and SOC 2 just because they want the security benefits. But the reality is, I speak to a lot of customers who are planning to do this and they need it in a hurry, and it's nearly always commercially driven. And given that it's commercially driven, you need to make sure that whatever certification or SOC 2 report you're going to get matches the needs of your customers. So I think the first thing is to really make sure that you understand what the client is looking for when they're making these requests, because it's going to really impact the scope and therefore the cost. And just to give you a few examples of this, one, the customer demands and what you're hearing will impact ISO 27001 or SOC 2. And just from an audit perspective, for instance, we find, when we're pricing up for both of them, an ISO 27001 audit for a company is going to typically cost a bit less. So that's going to have an impact there. So you want to understand which way customers are sort of pushing and trying to listen into what they need. I think what we've typically seen is that if you're a European tech company and your clients are in Europe, initially you're going to get ISO 27001. If your clients are in America, primarily you're going to get SOC 2, and you might end up getting both as you grow. In fact, you probably will get both as you grow, but in that you can sort of manage your costs a bit in those first few years by choosing the one that's going to cater to the largest possible audience, and then leveraging that as much to the extent you can with the other audience. The next one, for instance, what your customers say might impact what accreditation body and therefore certification body you go for. For instance, we speak to a lot of German customers and we're growing quite quickly in Germany. And sometimes we'll get a type of client that has a very traditional German clientele that will need a DAX accredited certification body. And in that instance, we'll say, well, we probably aren't the right fit for you. You should find a certification body in Germany. And I think understanding the needs of your customers is going to sort of support you in making sure you get the right certificate. I think given that probably most people on this call are UK based, UCAS is going to reduce risk there. But sometimes it's going to be a bit more expensive than finding an international one. But at the benefit that UCAS is really prestigious and it's going to work everywhere in the world, you're never going to have any risks with that. And likewise, if you're getting SOC 2, you'll need to consider the trust services criteria. So there are 5 trust services criteria: security, confidentiality, availability, data processing integrity, and privacy. Each of them add in more controls, which means more effort on implementation, and then more to audit and therefore more audit costs. So you then need to consider which trust services criteria to include, and this will then impact your sort of your cost. So if a customer has not specifically stated it, I'd assume you focus on security, maybe confidentiality and availability, and probably don't do privacy and processing integrity unless it's a specific requirement, because that will often add on just for the audit 30 to 40% cost for those two.
Fantastic, thank you. I just want to bring out a note that you said there, Rob. We're assuming that most of our people here are in the UK, but if you want to pop in the chat kind of where you're from, it's be really interesting to get a gauge of where people are coming from. So moving on then to sort of the audit. What do auditors look for during the SOC 2 and ISO 27001 assessments?
Cool. Great. Well, just to start with, if we can go on to the next slide. I'm not going to run through this whole table, but I think this might be useful for anyone who wants to see the slides later. But I think the starting point to consider how we do audits differently, and therefore what we look for, is just trying to think about the nature of the assessment. So an ISO 27001 audit is a moment in time. We are checking compliance with every clause and control at the time of that audit. And obviously, we need to see that audit controls have been functioning, but it's not a sort of backward looking. We're looking at sort of 6 months or a set time frame. Whereas a SOC 2 audit is or a type 2 SOC 2 audit is backwards facing for a set amount of time. And therefore this sort of changes the characteristics of an audit. In a way, an ISO 27000 audit can be a bit more forgiving because, as an audit body there, we're going to go through and we are going to raise non-conformities, but there's going to be a process to close them out. And then you're going to get the same certificate as any other company, whether you've had non-conformities or not, once you've been through that process. Whereas a SOC 2, it's backwards looking over 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. And once you get there, you've got to make sure the controls have been operating from the beginning. And it therefore means that the audit is much more about, let's see the volume of evidence that we need to go through, and the customer needs to provide all the evidence. And then it makes it a much more sort of asynchronous, agile process of us just going through all the right amount of evidence and going, is there the right amount of evidence for this control or for this one? Whereas I think what would be good is if I can just jump through and actually talk through the different actual audit processes one by one, and this might sort of give a bit of light in terms of how they operate. So So I think just starting with the ISO 27001 process, obviously this is a very European codified standard, and there are lots of rules in terms of how the audits are delivered. In fact, there's its own standard that we are audited against to make sure that we operate that. And it starts from a very rigorous, like, this is the right amount of audit days that have to be booked in depending on the size of the company. And then we follow the process very rigorously. So just to give you an idea, for a 1 to 10 person company, we're talking about 3 audit days spread out over 2 stages and 1 day of report writing. And then for a 100 person company, we're talking about 6, 7, 8 audit days. And those audit lengths will be very sort of defined by a standard. In fact, actually a good tip is, people can reach out to me and I can share this, but there is an audit length headcount, and there are some tips for coming in to get a good price on an audit to make sure that you sort of work your headcount to be in the right numbers by understanding things like identical roles in the company. So I think with an ISO 27001 audit, we are looking for sufficient objective evidence of conformity against every clause and control. And we'll have these quite sort of rigorous fixed audit days. Tempo, we like to be quite sort of agile and async with them in the sense that we don't want our customers to be tied in for 8 hours straight while we can review evidence asynchronously. But we're going to go through clause by clause, control by control, and find sufficient objective evidence. And then we'll get to the end of the stage 2 audit. We typically have a gap of about 2 weeks between a stage 1 and then a stage 2. And then we'll either have a full body of evidence of conformity, in which case, great, we'll confirm that with the customer and we can move to sort of issuing a certificate within a few days. Or we'll highlight a few non-conformities, or however many non-conformities have been raised. And then that's where we'll work with the customer to go through the remediation stage, which at Tempo is relatively fast moving. And we normally sort of work with the customer to sort of close those out in about 2 or 3 days after the audit finishes. But it's sort of this fixed time process, sort of in terms of the audit days, and we're going to move through quite quickly, and we're going to find specific evidence of controls operating at that time. So, and then we're moving on to the surveillance audits in the following year. I think if we move on to the SOC 2 slide, it's a bit different process in the sense that a SOC 2 audit, it's about the volume of evidence that we need looking backwards for 3, 6, 9, 12 months. The length of time can be decided by the customer. Increasingly, we're moving to a world where people need their SOC 2 their type 2 quite quickly, in which case they do 3 months initially and then move forward to the sort of more desired 12-month reports. But historically, they've been 12 months of controls operating. And because we need to see all this like group of evidence going back over this period of time, it becomes a much more asynchronous audit process. So we ask that customers arrive with evidence already uploaded onto whatever tool they're using. So if we're delivering an audit through Vanta or Drata, we can deliver the audit directly through those. If they're using any other service, we ask them to upload it onto the platform that we deliver the audit through, called Pillar. And then once the evidence uploaded, it becomes this process where we collaborate with the customer, but we're doing it away from them. So in the sense that we'll have the opening meeting at the start of the first week, and then we're just going through in the background, checking all the evidence, validating it against the control framework. As necessary, we will get in touch with them and we'll say, hey, we can't see enough for this one. Can you help us out? We'll have as many calls as necessary, but generally we're doing it away from them. Whereas an ISO audit is much more like hands-on. We've got those specific days. We're going to go through, we're going to request evidence as necessary. But this feels a bit more sort of asynchronous and just like gathering sufficient evidence, basically. And then for us, we get to the end of the closing meeting, we've gathered everything we need, and then we're into the case of wrapping up the report and signing it off.
Thanks, Rob. I just want to quickly say, Rod just put in the comments that the font is not readable on the table. So what we'll do is we will send these slides out at the end after this is finished, and we'll make sure that you can read that information clearly. So apologies that you couldn't see on screen, but you will get the information in your inboxes once this is finished.
Cool.
And
I should say this is just helpful just to sort of understand how a type 1 and type 2 audit sort of fits together. So one of the issues with a type 2, or at least one of the issues with a type 2 that we see regularly, is that customers can go directly to a type 2. So without any, basically the type 1 is an optional sort of step in the journey to a type 2. And it means that many companies, to reduce costs, are going directly to a type 2 and they miss out the type 1 stage. And that gets my antennae buzzing, because the risk of going to a type 2 without knowing that all your controls are in place is that, it's a backwards looking audit. And if your controls weren't in place at the beginning of the assessment window, then we potentially have a problem, because then what's in the report stays in the report, and then you get a report that doesn't show all the outcomes that you want to show. And there are lots of what they call exceptions. So this shows you a sort of zoomed out example of if you do a type 1 first, which is basically a moment in time version to show that the controls are functioning. It gives you confidence that the controls are all functioning. And then you start the observation window, which can again be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. And then you do the type 2 audit, as I mentioned, and then you get the report. So this shows you sort of time, a zoomed out example where you can understand how this sort of fits in, where you get this sort of moment to check that your controls are in place before moving on to the full type 2 audit.
Thank you. So going back to Sam now, we want to look at how to prepare for a successful audit or certification process.
Yep. So there are multiple documented information requirements that companies need to consider when they're looking at implementing some sort of framework, either SOC 2 or ISO 27001. So we'd always start with looking at what the company already has, if they have any documentation that's reflective of the current processes or their technical control requirements, and then look to enhance or kind of tweak those policies for sort of standard or framework compliance. So yeah, looking at what the company's already got, creating a set of policy documents that define clearly the company requirements and what's required of employees, company stakeholders, those types of individuals. Companies, or we're seeing more and more that businesses are going down the gap analysis route rather than direct to implementation. In certain instances. So gap analysis is really designed for somebody like myself or somebody else from the Assent team to go to a business or deliver a remote piece of work, and we'll kind of take a look at what they have currently in comparison to the framework requirements, and we'll look at an overview of where we can see any gaps, and give them a bit of an idea or a bit of a flavour for how big the project might be for them to get from where they are to framework compliance, whether that's certification based 27001 or whether their attestation report needs to, like Rob mentioned earlier, have certain inclusions. Whatever milestone they need to get to, we can kind of give them a bit of an understanding of where they are right now and what resource and cost is going to be required to get them to the point that they want to be. So I'd always say gap analysis is beneficial, particularly in terms of these types of frameworks. The more technical frameworks, there's a lot involved, and they are typically much bigger than some of the other frameworks like your ISO 9001, 14001, 45001. Generally, it's a full standard plus additional controls. Control identification, implementation based on risk, which I think we touched on earlier, but really identifying an appropriate control set to the business based on what kind of data they hold, what their customer and legislative requirements are, if any regulatory requirements in there as well, and really looking to understand what the risks to the business are. So, for example, if we're looking at a high-profile business who are very well publicly known in a certain industry type, they might be a little bit more prone to cyber attacks, and sort of things of that nature. So we might focus more heavily on the security side of things, but really looking at where the risks are to that business. They might have, I guess, a pot of evidence, if you like, to review to say they've had some information security incidents. People have tried to cyber attack them. Somebody's tried to execute ransomware, malware, something of that nature. It's really sort of severe to operations, and the risk profile then really increases, and it's about identifying appropriate controls for that type of business. Looking at the statement of applicability, so the SOA for ISO 27001. So the SOA, for anyone who's not familiar, is essentially a control map for the business. So it maps the requirements of the Annex A controls, which is full standard clauses 1 to 10 plus 98 Annex A controls. And And it's mapping the requirements to what the business has effectively. So preparing that document can be really useful. For me, it tends to help someone like myself and also someone from Rob's side sort of understand where the business is at, what controls have been implemented. There's some justifications in there as to why certain controls have been included and excluded, which is very useful as well to understand kind of the methodology behind how the company's decided to architect the security posture. Statement of applicability is a very sort of key document and would kind of stem into that gap analysis side of things. It's essentially looking at the same or similar criteria. And then from the SOC 2 side, understanding the control framework, which I think Rob will probably have a little bit more information in terms of the certificate or the SOC 2 sort of compliance side from an external company point of view. It's more around kind of what control set that you identify as appropriate for your business.
Yeah, I mean, on just to build up on that one, I think when you're selecting a SOC 2 auditor, it's worth asking what their sort of standard control framework is, because it's not as sort of fixed as the Annex A controls in ISO 27001. And it's helpful to really understand that and ensure that you're prepared against their control framework. It's a bit like sort of asking what you're going to be tested on, and then you can make sure that all your evidence is prepared really neatly. For SOC 2, as I mentioned before, it's really about having that, having all the evidence prepared in advance. So just making sure that you've got that all sort of bulked out, and you often find that you might need 10 examples of an employee being onboarded, and you've just got to make sure that you've just gone through and gathered that evidence. I think on both sides, the biggest risk is lack of preparation from an audit perspective. So I mean, on the SOC 2 side, like a customer progressing to a type 2 should say type 2 without full readiness. I think I mentioned that before. And the solution and the solution there is either a type 1 or some sort of pre-assessment 3 months in advance. So a type 1 costs a bit more. It's effectively like a mini version of a type 2. We follow exactly the same process, but we have to just check that every control is operational. A pre-assessment's a bit more of a light sort of gap analysis assessment that we actually now bake that in as a standard when anyone ever wants to go to a type 2, because we've seen this a few times before where actually it's better just to get your ducks in a row and make sure that everyone's clear on what they need to do. So we would just come in and do a sort of quick check, and if they're not ready, we'd say, look, here's what you need to go away and set up, and then let's reconvene. When you're ready in a few months. And that's on the SOC 2 side. On the ISO 27001 side, obviously this is a bit of a sort of basic point, but we're looking for people to have done a good, have sort of delivered a good implementation. And I guess what you need to understand there is that we as auditors need to find evidence of conformity from each company for every clause and applicable control. So we're basically going through over the course of every audit and sort of trying to build up that evidence of conformity. The risk is where a company hasn't done a good implementation, and obviously everyone wants to come in and do it well. And there's the risk is that a lot of companies don't know what they don't know, so they think they've matched it to meet the standard, and then we arrive at an audit and they haven't. So I think the fix for that is either using a consultant, it's quite obvious, or someone internally who is competent and has been through this process before to go through that. And then obviously not everyone has the budget to do that. But I always say, if you're going to implement yourselves, then make sure you at least get a really good internal audit before you come through to the audit, because that means that you need to get the internal audit anyway. But it means you'll come through, you'll get an internal audit from someone who knows what they're doing. They'll highlight any issues, and then you can fix those, and then you're going to be in a much better position. So whenever I get any hint that the customer might not be well prepared, or they don't necessarily sort of understand the requirements, I'll always say, make sure you get a good internal audit, because that really reduces risk. And I think once you then get to the audit, having a positive attitude to resolve non-conformities quickly is vital. Like, nearly all our customers are fast-moving, solution-oriented people who need a certificate for a particular reason. And therefore, when non-conformities are raised, they're really fast in terms of going, cool, we know what we need to do. We'll resolve this, we'll get there. And then in that situation, we normally get them the report certificate 3 to 7 days after the stage 2 audit finishes, because they sort of match our speed and we match them, and we want to get them over the line.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Rob. So lastly, we're going to look at the common challenges organizations face, and then how to avoid them. Sam, do you want to kick this one off for us?
Yeah. So I'd say there's a number of challenges or common challenges that companies face. I'd say probably looping through to Rob's point earlier about being underprepared for the audit. So particularly in terms of if a common challenge that I see personally is sometimes I go into businesses who've adopted some sort of framework, maybe in a kind of a separate area, so like ISO 9001, ISO 14001, which are they're obviously reasonable frameworks, are internationally recognised. They're fantastic to implement. But the sheer size of something like 27001 or SOC 2 and the technical nature of it sometimes is underestimated. So a company might have been through the process of implementing ISO 9001 before implementing ISO 27001, which is a great idea because, as a lot of people on the call will know, 9001 is your initial framework really, and then the others kind of stem from there. It is typically how a lot of businesses decide to do it. But these are technical frameworks, so there's a lot involved. So the time scale for implementation of other types of standards and frameworks might be much shorter, much lower requirement in terms of resource, cost, spend. There's loads of different variables to consider, but underestimating, I guess, what needs to be done. Now, as Rob also alluded to, it depends on how you do it. I went into a company very recently where they created their own 9000 and 27001 management system, and they asked me to do an audit before their external assessment, and I arrived on site and they'd done it all themselves. It was absolutely massive. Their management system was huge. It was absolutely insane. There was a document for everything. There was controls here, there, and everywhere. And although the individual had done quite a good job in, considering that he'd not had any previous or prior industry experience, the first thing he said to me is, I wish you would have used someone like you in the first place to implement the management system, because it would have leaned out the level of resource we now have to put in to sort of maintain the system and make sure we demonstrate compliance against doing what we say we're going to do in our documented procedures. So yeah, I'd always say utilising someone like Rob alluded to, either somebody internal or some consultancy arrangement, somebody who's really able to identify what it is that you need as a business and map the requirements of the standard or the SOC 2 framework to what it is that you do, and really understand what your risks are and how to make the business better, really. But yeah, definitely underestimating the size of the standard and interpreting it as well. It is really difficult. I don't know if anyone's kind of read the standards. Obviously, Rob, you'll have read the standards like I have, and they may as well be written in French. They're not prescriptive. They don't tell you exactly what you need to do. A lot of the organization shall, and things like that. But there's no actual prescribed set of rules where the business must open its doors at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's not that prescriptive. So having an intermediary to really translate the standard requirements into what you actually need to do is really, really beneficial. So I'd say they're the main challenges for me that I see. And I guess just as a final one before I pass over to you, Rob, is timing as well. So we were talking earlier around, I guess, what the driver is behind companies looking to adopt some sort of framework implementation. And what we do see is that obviously there's variables that I guess are more key to the business than others. And if a customer wants you to adopt a framework to win £1 million worth of work, you're going to adopt the framework, right? You can absorb the cost into the profit from the job. But it's understanding, like I say, if you look at the size of the standard or of the SOC 2 framework, the time taken to implement that isn't a couple of months. And what we'll often see is I'll go to customers and they'll ask us to scope out some work, and we'll say, look, it's going to take us between X and Y amount of time, depending on obviously company resource availability, etc. And it will be put on the back burner, and then that tender will come up, and whoever the client is will be saying, if you don't get ISO 27001 or SOC 2, we can't consider you. And that last minute phone call is very different to the initial phone call of we need this now. So it's just anticipating the resource required, from the business, and also if there's anything external. interpreting the standard requirements. And yeah, like I say, it's just the size of the standards really for me.
Cool. I think just to reiterate what I was saying before is companies that are the biggest risk is that companies deliver it themselves and they don't know what they don't know. So they can go through the standard and they just don't quite, as Sam said, like understand the nuances or understand what auditors want. So I think my point on the ISO side is really make sure, if you're going to deliver it yourself, make sure that you either get a really good internal audit, or preferably you make the budget for some consultant or someone like Assent to come in and support you throughout the process, because we definitely see that when companies are prepared by a consultant that we know, they tend to they tend to be a much smoother audit experience. I think on the SOC 2 side, just making sure that you understand the control framework that you're working to and that you've really sort of focused on gathering that evidence. And again, the equivalent of a good internal audit, and that is a good pre-assessment or a type 1 potentially, just to make sure that you're in a good spot and you know exactly what's required.
Fabulous. Thank you guys for that. Really appreciate it. So that's the end of our slides now. So if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. Roger put one in right at the beginning, which is fantastic. Thank you, Roger. And he says, please remind us of the organization that publishes SOC 2.
Yeah, I mean, it's not publishers as much, but basically you want AICPA signed off report. So you basically want a report from typically what they call a CPA, which is effectively an accountancy practice in the US, and they're typically registered with the AICPA, which is the sort of American accountancy body. For instance, Tempo, we are not a CPA, so we actually deliver all the audit, much like we do with ISO 27001, and then we have a CPA in the US that signs it off. There are some European equivalents, CIMA, but generally, SOC 2 is an American standard, and generally we're talking about AICPA.
Fantastic. Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, please pop them in the chat and we can get them answered. I'll give it just a couple of minutes because I know sometimes it takes a minute for people to type in. We're not getting any immediately, so I'm going to make a very quick assumption that we have no questions, which means we've covered everything, which is fantastic. Look at that. What I will say, as we're at the end of our webinar here, if after we come off this and you think, oh, I do have some questions, we will be emailing out the slides to you, as I mentioned earlier, and this will be recorded so you can come back in and have a listen, but you can also then either reach out to Assent or to Robert Tempo as well if you have any questions, and we can continue this conversation further, so that's not a problem at all. But with no more questions coming in, I think we can wrap it up there. I want to say on behalf of Assent, thank you, Rob, for joining us from Tempo, and also Sam, thank you for representing Assent for us today. We really do appreciate it. And thank you very much.